The winter of 1944 on the Western Front became one of the harshest periods for German units, struggling under the pressure of the advancing Allied forces. Exhausted supply lines, destroyed infrastructure, and constant movement made it nearly impossible to maintain organized defenses. In these conditions, isolated groups of soldiers gradually lost the ability to operate cohesively. Many retreated without ammunition or food. Others simply fell back, trying to find safer positions. One such group would later arrive in an American prisoner of war camp, though none of its members could foresee how unusual their first days there would be. Their condition before capture was marked by extreme fatigue, physical deterioration, and a complete absence of certainty about the future. Days of marching in cold weather left no opportunity for rest. Attempts to secure food along the way proved futile. German supply depots were empty or destroyed, and the towns the soldiers passed through could offer nothing substantial. The notion of a regular daily ration had lost all meaning. Most survived on whatever they happened to find, and sometimes on nothing at all. In this state, any encounter with Allied forces became especially difficult. The very idea of continuing to fight had changed. Morale had fallen as the reality of the situation became undeniable. The soldiers understood that resources were gone and that ongoing resistance no longer held strategic purpose. Movement across the terrain was accompanied by a constant fear of running into armored units or coming under artillery fire. Organized defense was no longer possible, and groups of soldiers advanced without clear orders, guided primarily by the instinct to reach safer ground. During one of these days, a group of roughly 30 men reached a point where further resistance was impossible. Their strength had been completely depleted. They moved slowly, leaning on improvised sticks, many barely able to stand. The cold wind intensified the sense of weakness. Some soldiers had even lost the sense of time, drifting between exhaustion and brief moments of semi-consciousness. This moment proved decisive. Their bodies could no longer support continued movement. When the group encountered forward elements of American forces, resistance was no longer considered. Captivity had become less a choice and more an unavoidable consequence of their condition. Reports later noted that many of these soldiers were at the brink of physical collapse. Medical personnel who examined them afterward recorded signs of long-term malnutrition, dehydration, and severe exhaustion. The journey to the prisoner of war camp took several days. Unlike their previous experiences on the front, the transfer followed a predictable and orderly pattern. American units adhered to established protocols requiring that prisoners be treated in accordance with international standards. Still, the Germans, unaware of the conditions in Allied camps, approached the situation with anxiety and uncertainty. Much of their fear was shaped by rumors that had circulated among the troops in the preceding months. During the transfer, the prisoners received minimal but steady provisions, water, and small portions of food. For many, these meals felt unexpectedly nourishing despite their modest size. After weeks of near starvation, even a limited ration offered a noticeable improvement. Yet their bodies, weakened by prolonged deprivation, struggled to recover quickly. Most continued to experience dizziness, fatigue, and difficulty maintaining balance. When they finally saw the camp, their impressions were mixed. On one hand, the structured layout and clear division of sectors created a sense of unease. On the other hand, they saw no signs of mistreatment or neglect. The camp was organized with precise functionality, separate areas for housing, medical treatment, and food distribution. Some of the German soldiers, despite their exhaustion, attempted to assess their surroundings rationally. Their condition began to stabilize as they received water regularly and were shielded from the cold. But the moment that would change their perception of captivity did not occur during their arrival, during processing, or even during their first night. The turning point came with something that seemed ordinary: the first breakfast. None of the prisoners could have predicted that a simple morning meal would leave such a deep impression. What they were served would become one of the most discussed experiences within the camp, a moment of contrast so stark that it reshaped their understanding of what captivity meant under American control. The first night in the American prisoner of war camp passed quietly for the newly arrived German captives. After weeks of instability and constant movement, the structured environment felt unfamiliar. Guards followed routine procedures, medical personnel conducted basic examinations, and the camp operated with a level of discipline that contrasted sharply with the chaotic conditions the prisoners had recently experienced. Although the Germans remained wary, exhaustion made the night less tense than expected. By dawn, the temperature had risen slightly. The camp began to come alive with the predictable rhythm of military routine. The German prisoners were still weak from deprivation, and many struggled to rise when instructed. Medical assessments from the previous day had classified a large portion of the group as severely undernourished. Some men showed signs of muscular atrophy, while others moved carefully to avoid dizziness. Despite these conditions, the atmosphere among them carried a sense of cautious anticipation. They had no clear idea of what awaited them. American procedures for handling prisoners included providing regular meals, medical checks, and controlled daily activities. The Germans still did not fully understand the structure of camp life, and most expected the morning meal to be minimal, perhaps a thin soup or a small portion of bread. Their assumptions were shaped by the scarcity they had experienced during the final months on the front. Many had internalized the idea that food, in any form, had become a luxury. When the prisoners were directed toward the food distribution area, the scene that unfolded surprised them even before they reached the front of the line. The smell of freshly prepared food lingered in the air, a detail so unexpected that several prisoners later described it as disorienting. After long periods of hunger, the aroma alone triggered a physical reaction: increased salivation, stomach cramps, and sudden fatigue. Their bodies, unaccustomed to the anticipation of a real meal, responded with a mix of weakness and heightened alertness. The camp's kitchen was designed to serve large numbers of people quickly and efficiently. Massive metal containers, heating units, and organized stations formed a system that reflected American logistical capabilities. The Germans observed it in silence, many unable to comprehend how such a volume of food could be prepared so routinely. The equipment alone seemed more advanced than anything they had seen during the collapse of German supply lines. When their turn came, the prisoners received portions that would have seemed ordinary in civilian life, but, given their condition, appeared abundant and almost excessive. Each tray contained items the men had not expected to see: hot porridge, bread, a small piece of fruit, and even a modest amount of protein. For individuals who had spent weeks surviving on scraps or nothing at all, the contrast was overwhelming. Several of the prisoners struggled to eat at a normal pace. Medical staff kept a close eye on them, aware that sudden consumption of too much food could be dangerous for severely undernourished individuals. Some prisoners trembled as they held their utensils. Others paused frequently due to cramps or nausea brought on by their weakened digestive systems. Despite these difficulties, the meal provided not only physical nourishment but also a psychological shift. The Germans realized that the Americans were committed to maintaining camp conditions in accordance with established standards. The breakfast carried broader implications. Many prisoners had expected harsh treatment shaped by months of fear, propaganda, and the overall uncertainty of wartime captivity. Instead, they encountered a system that valued order and predictability. For soldiers who had recently experienced the collapse of their own supply structures, this was difficult to process. The contrast between their expectations and reality became one of the defining impressions of their early days in the camp. As the morning progressed, the prisoners were organized into small groups for registration and routine assessments. The food they had consumed began to take effect, providing a modest but noticeable boost in energy. Some stood straighter, others walked with more confidence. A few still showed signs of physical instability, but even these individuals appeared more alert than they had the previous day. American officers recorded data on the prisoners' conditions, ensuring that those requiring additional medical support were taken to designated areas. The system functioned methodically, with clear procedures for every step. The Germans watched this with a mixture of confusion and relief. The environment, though strictly controlled, did not resemble the scenarios they had feared. By the end of the morning, the significance of the breakfast had become clear to many of the prisoners. It represented not only sustenance, but also a signal of what to expect from their captors. The meal challenged assumptions shaped by exhaustion, uncertainty, and the desperation of the final phase of the war. It demonstrated that, despite being captives, they were now part of a structured environment where survival was no longer uncertain. What they had experienced that morning would be discussed repeatedly among them in the days that followed. The unexpected generosity of the meal became a reference point, a moment that marked the beginning of a new, unfamiliar chapter of their wartime experience. The days following the prisoners' first breakfast introduced a rhythm entirely different from anything they had experienced during the final phase of the war. For many of the German POWs, the contrast between the chaos of retreat and the order of captivity felt almost unreal. Their bodies still carried the effects of prolonged hunger, and their minds remained unsettled. But the camp's structured environment began to impose a sense of stability. American personnel maintained a schedule designed to monitor the prisoners' health and reintroduce predictable daily patterns. Medical teams conducted examinations to evaluate the effects of malnutrition. Many prisoners exhibited symptoms that reflected weeks of deprivation, weakened immune responses, slow reflexes, muscle loss, and signs of early vitamin deficiency. For some, even moderate activity caused fatigue. Physicians documented these conditions carefully, noting which prisoners required additional nutritional support or reduced workloads. The first full day of routine revealed how strongly food distribution shaped camp life. The breakfast had made a significant impression on the prisoners, but the meals that followed reinforced that their captors intended to maintain this standard consistently. Lunch and dinner, although simpler, still contained more nutrition than anything the Germans had received for months. The sudden regularity of hot meals affected both their physical and emotional states. Some prisoners regained strength quickly. Others improved more slowly as their bodies adjusted to a stable intake of calories. The camp itself operated with strict but not oppressive discipline. Barriers, guard towers, and controlled pathways maintained order, yet the treatment remained consistent with international standards. The guards adhered to routine procedures and avoided unpredictable behavior, something that surprised many prisoners who had expected harsher conditions. This predictability created an environment where survival no longer depended on improvisation or constant movement. Within several days, the Germans began to understand the structure of the camp. Designated areas existed for rest, hygiene, medical care, and work assignments. Although they remained prisoners, the environment offered a kind of security that had been absent during their last weeks on the front. The psychological shift was gradual but noticeable. The men no longer feared immediate starvation. Their focus turned instead toward regaining strength and adapting to the new reality of confinement. Physical recovery varied widely. Some prisoners, particularly younger ones, responded quickly to restored nutrition. Their posture improved, movements became steadier, and they could maintain longer periods of activity. Others, especially those who had been severely weakened before capture, required more time. Medical staff monitored their response to food carefully, adjusting portions when necessary to avoid placing strain on their compromised systems. The social dynamics among the prisoners also began to shift. Initially, exhaustion had limited communication, and most had focused only on survival. But as their conditions slowly improved, they began forming small groups, typically based on previous unit affiliation or shared experience. Within these groups, they attempted to piece together the events that had led to their current situation. The breakfast they had received on the first morning became a recurring reference point not because of its quantity, but because of the unexpected normalcy it represented after weeks of deprivation. American personnel continued to observe the prisoners' behavior. Reports noted improvements in cooperation and reductions in medical incidents related to malnutrition. Work assignments were introduced gradually, with careful consideration of each prisoner's physical capabilities. These tasks were simple and designed primarily to maintain camp operations rather than contribute to any broader effort. Completing such tasks gave the prisoners a sense of routine that helped stabilize their daily lives. Despite the relative order of the camp, uncertainty remained. Prisoners did not know how long they would stay, nor what their future held. Their thoughts frequently returned to families, to the state of Germany, and to the war's trajectory. However, the predictability of camp life helped contain these anxieties. For individuals who had reached the brink of collapse only days earlier, the ability to sleep, eat, and receive medical attention had an immediate effect on their psychological resilience. Over time, the morning meal, initially a shock, became a symbol of transition. It marked the moment when survival was no longer in doubt. Although the prisoners had lost control over their freedom, they had regained something fundamental: the assurance that their basic needs would be met. This assurance became the foundation on which they rebuilt their strength and adapted to captivity. By the end of the first week, even those who remained physically weak showed signs of improvement. The camp's strict structure no longer seemed threatening. Instead, it felt like a boundary that prevented the chaos of the outside world from intruding. The Germans began to understand that their captors had no intention of depriving them further. For many, this realization marked the beginning of acceptance, a shift from the desperate mindset of retreat to the more stable rhythm of life within the camp. The transformation had begun with a simple breakfast. Everything that followed flowed from that moment of unexpected nourishment, setting the stage for what the prisoners would later view as an unlikely turning point in their wartime experience. As weeks passed, the German prisoners settled into a routine that contrasted sharply with the conditions they had endured before capture. The camp structure remained strict, yet it provided stability, and stability gradually reshaped the prisoners' physical and psychological states. What had begun as a moment of shock, the unexpectedly generous breakfast, evolved into a foundation for recovery. Medical records documented steady improvement. Weight increased slowly, muscle strength returned, and symptoms of deprivation diminished. For many, this recovery happened faster than they anticipated. Regular meals, medical supervision, and predictable schedules created an environment where the body could repair itself. Even men who had struggled to walk during their first days in the camp began moving with greater confidence. The camp's internal organization made this recovery possible. Work assignments continued but remained moderate, focused on basic maintenance rather than labor-intensive tasks. The purpose was not to extract effort but to provide structure. Guards monitored health carefully, adjusting workloads or diets when necessary. For individuals who had expected punishment or harsh treatment, this approach challenged deeply rooted assumptions. As their strength returned, the prisoners gained the ability to observe camp life with greater clarity. They noticed the consistency in American procedures, scheduled roll calls, orderly meal distribution, regular medical checks. There were no unexpected disruptions. This predictability created a psychological buffer that allowed many prisoners to confront their new reality without the fear that had dominated their lives during the retreat. The breakfast that had astonished them on the first morning became symbolic. It marked the moment they realized that captivity under the Americans did not mean further suffering. Over time, the meal took on a retrospective significance. It represented not just food, but the first indication that their lives would be governed by rules rather than chaos. By late winter, the prisoners' physical condition had improved enough that many began to reflect on their journey to captivity. The contrast between the final days of retreat and the camp's routine was stark. Hunger had shaped their thoughts and actions during the collapse at the front. Now, with their basic needs met, they were able to process the events that had brought them here. Some focused on memories of home. Others thought about the uncertain future of Germany. But the desperation that once dictated their behavior had faded. The American personnel, following established protocols, continued to document the prisoners' progress. Reports noted the transformation. Individuals who had arrived in near collapse now exhibited stable vital signs and improved morale. This improvement was attributed to consistent nutrition, medical intervention, and the absence of further hardship. The camp became an example of how structured care could reverse the effects of prolonged deprivation. As spring approached, the prisoners understood that their situation, while still uncertain, had stabilized. Their days unfolded according to patterns that no longer felt threatening. Some even perceived the camp not as a place of confinement, but as a temporary haven from a war that had already consumed so much. They remained soldiers and captives, but the immediate struggle for survival had ended. The breakfast that had once seemed unbelievable now blended into the expected rhythm of camp life. Yet the memory of that morning persisted. It stood at the intersection of two phases of their wartime experience: the collapse that nearly destroyed them and the structured environment that rebuilt them. In retrospect, it became a point of transition, an unexpected moment when the trajectory of their lives shifted away from desperation and toward recovery. By the time they fully adjusted to captivity, the prisoners could recognize the broader implication of that first meal. It demonstrated that even in the final tumultuous months of the war, the systems governing their captors prioritized order over retribution. For men who had walked to the edge of physical collapse, this realization brought a sense of coherence to an otherwise disorienting chapter of their lives. The war would continue beyond the fences of the camp, but for the prisoners, the critical turning point had already occurred. It arrived not in the form of a battle or a command, but as a breakfast served to starving men who had expected nothing and received far more than they imagined possible.